Less than 1% of Americans know about the Sultana shipwreck. It's believed that it killed up to 1,800 people.
What if I told you there are shipwrecks that no one talks about, even though they were far worse than the Titanic? The Titanic is remembered as the ultimate maritime disaster, but there are shipwrecks even more horrifying that history rarely mentions them. These forgotten tragedies claimed thousands of lives in unimaginable ways, leaving behind haunting stories of chaos and loss. Why have these catastrophic events been buried in the shadows? And what really happened these ill-fated days? Join us as we reveal the chilling details of shipwrecks far worse than the Titanic. Number 12. MV Doña Paz. On December 20th, 1987, just 5 days before Christmas, the MV Doña Paz, a passenger ferry, set sail through the Tabla Strait in the Philippines from Tacloban Island to Manila. It made stops in Catbalogan, Samar, carrying many passengers, most of whom were returning home for the holiday. The journey so far had been smooth under Captain Eusebio Nazareno's command, with the vessel expected to reach Manila by 4 in the morning the next day. However, no one anticipated what was about to happen. Originally built as an oil tanker, the Doña Paz was converted into a passenger ferry with a capacity of 1,518, though safety standards remained poor. Despite this, the ferry was overcrowded with an estimated 4,386 people on board, almost 3 times the permitted amount, and that would lead to disaster. Around 10:30 that night, the ferry was near Dumali Point in the Tabla Strait, when it collided with the MT Vector, an oil tanker carrying gasoline and petroleum products. The collision triggered a massive fireball from the gasoline, quickly engulfing the Doña Paz and turning it into a nightmare. Most passengers, asleep at the time, woke up to find their peaceful journey transformed into a sea of fire. Survivors like Philippine Constabulary Corporal Luzgardo Nieto reported that the lights on the ferry went out right after the crash. There were no life vests available, and crew members were in panic, giving no orders or organizing passengers. The life jackets were locked away, and nobody seemed to remember them as flames consumed both ships. The Doña Paz sank within 2 hours, while the Vector took about 4 hours to go down. A passing inter-island ship, the MS Don Claudio, witnessed the explosion and later found survivors in the shark-infested waters of the Tabla Strait. Only 26 people were saved, 24 from the Doña Paz and 2 from the Vector. Tragically, every crew member on the Doña Paz perished. Doctors and nurses attended to the few survivors who were left to swim through the charred remains of their loved ones.
The passengers were in total panic. They ran around, maybe trying to get to their companions who were on other parts of the ship.
It took Philippine maritime authorities 8 hours to learn about the disaster and another 8 to begin rescue missions. The disaster claimed 4,885 lives from both vessels, making it the deadliest peacetime shipwreck in history. An investigation by the Philippine Coast Guard revealed that only one apprentice was on duty at the bridge during the collision. It became apparent that many key crew members were absent from the bridge, choosing instead to relax in the recreation room, watching TV, drinking beer, and playing cards. An official from Sulpicio Lines later admitted that many passengers bought tickets illegally on board, and some were not listed on the manifest. By December 28th, Northern Samar representative Raul Daza estimated that at least 2,000 unlisted passengers were on the ship. Today, the wreck, which was discovered in 2019, remains at a depth of 1,600 feet. When discussing maritime disasters, the Doña Paz ferry tragedy is often the first to come to mind. However, the deadliest single ship sinking ever recorded took place 42 years earlier, when a German vessel sank. Number 11. MV Wilhelm Gustloff. This tragedy is often overlooked as the worst maritime disaster due to its classification as a military transport. However, on that tragic day, the majority of passengers were civilians. The disaster claimed more lives than the Titanic, Lusitania, Britannic, and several other maritime tragedies combined. The Wilhelm Gustloff, built in 1936 under Adolf Hitler's orders, was initially a cruise ship offering affordable vacations for German workers. But with the outbreak of World War II, the ship transitioned into a hospital vessel, but later became a stationary barracks for U-boat crews in Gdynia, Poland. By January 1945, as World War II neared its end, the Red Army was advancing rapidly. Germany launched Operation Hannibal, a large-scale evacuation of soldiers and civilians from East Prussia by sea. The Wilhelm Gustloff, docked in Gdynia for years, was one of the ships used in this effort. Although its official capacity was under 2,000, it was overwhelmed with more than 10,000 people, many of whom boarded through bribery or desperation. On January 30th, the ship left port around noon. Later that night, 3 Soviet torpedoes struck the vessel, causing it to tilt and sink in under 70 minutes. Many drowned, froze in the icy Baltic waters, or were crushed in the chaos. The disaster claimed an estimated 9,343 lives, including German civilians, wounded soldiers, and Nazi officials. Only around 1,200 people survived. The freezing temperatures and overcrowding contributed significantly to the death toll, and some blame the captain's decision to illuminate the ship, making it an easy target for the Soviet submarine. For weeks afterward, frozen bodies continued to wash ashore, just to show how big the tragedy was. But across the Atlantic, years earlier, another ship had faced its own nightmare. One not born of war, but of a quiet, unassuming moment that turned deadly in the blink of an eye. Number 10. SS Eastland. Next is the shipwreck with the highest number of casualties in US history. On July 24, 1915, despite the cool, damp weather, over 2,500 passengers and crew crowded onto the Great Lakes excursion steamer Eastland.
An iconic scene, the Eastland capsized in the Chicago River.
Ready for their morning departure. This ship was one of 5 boats chartered for this company picnic, with over 7,000 tickets sold. Many of the passengers were Western Electric staff and their families, excited for a rare Saturday off. As the boat started filling up around 7 that morning, a steady drizzle started, and some passengers headed below deck to find shelter. The main cabin was lively with music, and on the upper deck, people jostled for spots or leaned against the railing. As the Eastland continued to load passengers, it began to tilt to one side, but no one was overly concerned. The harbour master and some observers on land noticed the movement but did not see it as alarming. By the time the last passenger found his way onto the deck, the boat had momentarily righted itself. However, after a few minutes, the Eastland tilted even more. Water started pouring through the open gangways into the engine room, and crew members scrambled up a ladder to the main deck as they realized the gravity of the situation. In less than 5 minutes, the Eastland had tilted to a 45-degree angle. The piano on the promenade deck rolled over, almost hitting 2 women. A refrigerator slid to one side, pinning a woman underneath it. Water flooded the cabins below deck. The scene quickly turned chaotic. This was turning into the deadliest shipwreck in the history of the Great Lakes. Although the Eastland had enough lifeboats, rafts, and life preservers for all its passengers, these safety measures actually posed a risk due to their weight. The 1912 sinking of the Titanic had spurred new safety regulations, and now the Eastland had been overloaded with too much weight on the upper decks. Modifications made to increase the boat's speed and passenger capacity made it top-heavy and unstable. The Eastland had a history of near capsizes and was often referred to as an unsafe vessel. It did not take long for the boat to roll over onto its side. Passengers on the upper deck were thrown into the water or managed to walk across the exposed hull to safety. Many didn't even get their feet wet as they climbed over the rail to safety. Onlookers along the riverbank tried to help. Some jumped into the river, some threw boards or wooden crates to struggling passengers. The scene was chaotic. Stretcher bearers moved bodies, and divers tried to reach those trapped underwater. The Eastland lay on its side, and rescuers marked every spot where a body was found with a chalk X. By evening, rescue operations were in full swing, and the grim task of recovering bodies continued. By the end of the day, 844 people had lost their lives. Sadly, not long after, another vessel, laden with hope and celebration, would become the site of unimaginable horror that left devastation in its wake. Number 9. The Sultana. This grand side-wheel steamboat stretched 3 decks tall and 260 feet long, capable of transporting goods and passengers with remarkable efficiency. Yet the spring of 1865 saw this vessel transform into a site of unimaginable devastation. On April 26, 1865, the Sultana departed Helena, Arkansas, overcrowded with nearly 2,200 passengers, primarily Union soldiers recently released from Confederate prison camps. By the time it reached Memphis, Tennessee, the steamboat unloaded heavy cargo, further destabilizing its structure. Around afternoon the next day, just 7 miles north of Memphis, 3 of the boat's 4 boilers exploded catastrophically. The violent blast tore through the vessel's core, ripping apart its decks and throwing hundreds of passengers into the Mississippi River. The explosion set off a chain of horrors. The towering smokestacks collapsed, crushing passengers below, while the exposed fireboxes ignited flames that spread uncontrollably. Soldiers, civilians, and crew members scrambled to escape the inferno, many leaping into the icy river. Some clung to debris, while others drowned in the chaotic waters. Emaciated from their time in captivity, many former prisoners lacked the strength to survive the frigid currents. As the wreckage floated downstream, survivors clung to treetops or rooftops of submerged structures, awaiting rescue. The steamboat Boston No. 2 arrived at the scene, rescuing around 150 people and alerting others to the disaster. Meanwhile, smaller boats from Memphis rushed to retrieve survivors from the water, but the scale of the tragedy was overwhelming. The Sultana's remains burned for hours before drifting into a cluster of trees near Hen Island, where the last survivors were rescued. By morning, the once mighty steamboat sank beneath the Mississippi's waters, leaving behind a grim toll. Of the approximately 2,200 individuals on board, only 963 survived. The rest perished, making the Sultana disaster deadlier than the sinking of the Titanic in terms of lives lost.
It's believed that it killed up to 1,800 people, and it happened in 1865 right here in Arkansas.
Rescue efforts brought survivors to Memphis hospitals and shelters, but the toll on those who endured was immense. Many suffered from severe burns, broken bones, and exposure to the freezing waters. Tragically, only a handful of women survived, and all children on board were lost. With coffins running out, Memphis laid victims side by side on the levee, draped in cloth, while many bodies were swept miles downstream, never to be recovered. Investigations into the disaster revealed that overcrowding, coupled with faulty boiler maintenance, led to the explosion. The government briefly entertained sabotage theories, but ultimately determined that insufficient water levels and excessive steam pressure caused the boilers to fail. Despite mounting evidence of negligence, no one was held accountable. Captain Frederick Speed faced trial for overloading the vessel, but his conviction was later overturned. Meanwhile, Captain Reuben Hatch, the officer responsible for overcrowding, evaded justice entirely. The Sultana disaster was eclipsed by concurrent historical events, including the assassination of President Lincoln, the surrender of Confederate generals, and the pursuit of Jefferson Davis. These monumental occurrences overshadowed the tragedy, leaving it largely forgotten by the broader public. Just as the prisoners on the Sultana were left helpless at sea and betrayed by their government, the next victims faced a different kind of silence, one where even when help eventually arrived, nothing was done. Number 8. La Joola. September 2002 was a dark month in Africa after the ferry La Joola, a 260-ton vessel that set sail from Ziguinchor in southern Senegal towards Dakar, the capital city, was involved in the continent's deadliest shipwreck. La Joola usually made the 300-mile journey twice a week, but it had been out of service for nearly a year due to engine repairs. Finally, at the end of 2002, it resumed only one weekly trip to test the new engine. Despite the limited schedule, there was high demand for tickets. On September 26th, La Joola departed again, heavily packed with 1,863 passengers, more than 3 times its intended capacity of 580. As it left the port, it was clear that the ship was dangerously overloaded, visibly tilting to one side. The atmosphere on board was initially lively, but everything changed at 11 in the night, when La Joola hit a severe storm halfway through its journey. Normally, the ship could handle rough weather, but with so many passengers sleeping on the upper deck, it became dangerously unstable. It became a nightmare for passengers as, 5 minutes into the storm, La Joola rolled over. with the bottom of the vessel surfacing above the water. Many passengers managed to survive the initial capsizing, but were trapped in small air pockets within the overturned ship. The crew was caught off guard by the rapid tilt of the ferry and didn't send out a distress signal in time. It wasn't until one of the survivors launched flares that nearby fishing boats came to help. These boats managed to rescue some passengers from the water, but official rescue teams didn't arrive until the next morning. Even then, they couldn't save those still trapped under the upturned ferry. 16 hours after the disaster, Joola sank completely, leaving 1,799 dead and only 64 survivors to tell the story of Africa's deadliest maritime disaster. In the case of the next ship, the victims were so desperate to forget what had happened that they abandoned their identities entirely, hoping their heart-wrenching stories would remain forever untold. Number 7. SS General Slocum. On June 15, 1904, Manhattan's Lower East Side was buzzing with activity as the men of Kleindeutschland, Little Germany, prepared for their workday. Just after 9 that morning, a group from St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, mostly women and children, boarded the General Slocum for their annual end-of-school outing. The excitement was palpable as they stepped onto what was touted as the largest and most splendid excursion steamer in New York, waving flags and chatting away in their Sunday school outfits. As the band played on deck, children romped around while adults sang along, waiting for the ship to set sail. Just before 10 in the morning, the ship's crew began casting off the lines, and the General Slocum headed up the East River toward Long Island Sound, bound for a picnic spot on the north shore of Long Island. There were about 1,350 people on board, including crew and catering staff. Built in 1891 and owned by the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company, the General Slocum was constructed from white oak, locust, and yellow pine, and could carry up to 2,500 passengers. Just a month before, a fire inspector had found the ship's fire equipment to be in good order. Around 97th Street, the crew noticed puffs of smoke rising through the wooden deck and quickly ran below deck to the second cabin. But they had never conducted fire drills, and when they tried to use the ship's fire hoses, the rotten hoses burst. Panicking, they reported to Captain William Van Schaik that they were dealing with a fire they couldn't control. The captain decided to keep moving to avoid the strong currents and potential breakdown of the steering gear. He aimed for North Brother Island, hoping to beach the ship there, but the fire quickly spread due to the fresh north wind, engulfing the ship in flames. Passengers panicked, with mothers screaming for their children as hundreds of people jumped overboard, many unable to swim. Life jackets provided by the crew were also rotten, and rescue boats that arrived at the scene mostly found children's bodies in the water. A large white yacht with the insignia of the New York Yacht Club arrived but did nothing to assist. Its captain merely watched the unfolding disaster through binoculars. On North Brother Island, where patients with contagious diseases had been quarantined, hospital staff tried to prepare for rescue operations. Captain Van Schaik managed to ground the Slocum sideways near the shore, but the heat made it impossible to get close. Rescuers, including firefighters and hospital staff, tried to pull survivors to safety, but were mostly met with horror. The greatest maritime disaster in American peacetime history resulted in 121 deaths, mostly women and children. One remarkable survivor was a 10-month-old boy, uninjured but left orphaned, who floated to shore and was later identified by his grandmother. 11-year-old Willie Kepler, who sneaked onto the excursion without his parents' permission, managed to survive by avoiding the flailing passengers who dragged each other down in panic. He was too scared of punishment to return home until he saw his name among the dead in the newspaper. The disaster left Kleindeutschland reeling as families were suddenly torn apart. Funerals stretched over a week, and the desolate schoolyards of Little Germany were stark reminders of their loss. Many widowers and broken families moved uptown to Yorkville, creating a new German town on the Upper East Side. Some chose to return to Germany. Over time, Kleindeutschland disappeared beneath the waves of Polish and Russian immigrants in New York City, much like the next ship sank with China's hopes for a different kind of government. Number 6. SS Kiangya. The Kiangya was a small coastal passenger ship, just over 2,000 tons, and it began its journey from Nanjing with an overloaded load of approximately 2,150 paying passengers, far exceeding its official capacity of 1,200. In early December 1948, it docked at Shanghai's Shiliupu dock, where even more passengers, including stowaways and friends of the crew, managed to board. The ship left Shanghai on December 4th, bound for Ningbo, which is about 200 miles to the south. Late in the evening, as it passed out of the Yangtze mouth about 50 miles northeast of Shanghai, the ship was rocked by a large explosion at the stern. It quickly settled, resting upright on the riverbed with only the upper decks, funnel and masts visible above water. The lower decks flooded quickly, and the radio room was destroyed before a distress signal could be sent. It took over 3 hours for the first distress flares to be spotted by a passing steamer, which then raised the alarm with local authorities. Smaller boats rushed to rescue passengers stranded with the wreck, many waist-deep in water. An estimated 700 were saved, but many drowned or succumbed to hypothermia before help arrived. The exact death toll, estimated between 400 and 4,000, remains uncertain due to the unregistered passengers on board. More recently, it's estimated that around 3,250 passengers were on the ship, with over 2,300 presumed drowned. Initially, the ship's owners blamed the communists, suggesting sabotage, possibly from a mine or bomb thrown by nearby junks. The US naval authorities initially supported this, but later evidence pointed to a mine as the cause. Chinese and American divers inspecting the wreck after the sinking attributed it to a mine, though its origin remains unknown. Despite splitting in two, the Kiangya was salvaged in 1959 and renamed Dongfang Hong. It operated on the Yangtze River for many years before being disposed of in the early 1990s. Just weeks after the Kiangya's sinking, another refugee ship collided with another vessel, resulting in a high death toll. Number 5. Taiping steamer. Just a day before the festive Chinese New Year's Eve in 1949, tragedy struck. News of the Red Army's victory and the Nationalist forces' retreat swirled through the city. By nightfall, the dock was crowded with passengers, pushing and shoving to board the Taiping steamer. Despite having only 508 tickets available, the ship was loaded with 1,500 people, a mix of wealthy passengers, stowaways, and even friends of the crew hoping to escape the turmoil. A few minutes after 4 that evening, the Taiping steamer finally set sail for Keelung Harbor, but 7 hours later, as the ship drifted quietly through the dark sea at 8 knots per hour, it was struck by the smaller Qianyuan steamer near the Zhoushan archipelago. The collision was nearly invisible in the pitch-black night. Of the 1,500 passengers on board, only 37 survived. Among the dead were military officials, a former provincial chairman, National Assembly representatives, and wealthy merchants. Their bodies were lost to the sea, leaving families shattered and memories marred by unspeakable pain. Years later, survivors and bereaved families still recall the harrowing events. A 92-year-old survivor named Yang remembers how he desperately searched for his wife's body in the stormy, dark waters, his voice choking with emotion. Some stories, like that of Professor Shi Hanjing, still resonate vividly. Shi recounts how his townsman Li Shuwen survived the disaster clinging to a wooden box, losing his wife and struggling to stay afloat as others gave up one by one. The causes of the tragedy are disputed. Some blame the overloading of the ship with too many passengers and cargo, while others point to the crew's negligence. However, Lin Chengliang, a retired captain, refutes such claims, pointing instead to the overloading as the primary reason for the disaster. According to Lin, the stringent enforcement of martial law forced the Taiping steamer to travel without lights after dark, making it nearly invisible to other vessels. Being stranded in stormy, dark waters feels like a lost cause for help, but it doesn't compare to being trapped in a sinking ship. Number 4. SS Pacific. On November 4, 1875, tragedy struck off the coast of Washington Territory. The sidewheel steamship SS Pacific, en route from Victoria to San Francisco, collided with a freighter called the Orpheus. The impact sent the Pacific sinking quickly into the depths of the ocean, more than 1,000 feet below the surface. Captain Jefferson Davis Howell of the Pacific had only 2 of his 3 crewmen on duty as night fell. The ship was struggling, listing heavily and leaking water. Lights were out on the port side, and it was clear the vessel was in poor condition. Meanwhile, Captain Charles Sawyer of the Orpheus spotted the approaching Pacific but could not maneuver quickly enough to avoid a collision. The Pacific struck the Orpheus 3 times before the crew sounded a whistle and reversed engines, but it was too little, too late. The Pacific's starboard planks buckled under the impact, and the ship rapidly took on water. The lifeboats, already in disarray, were difficult to launch. Only 2 passengers survived, Henry Jelly and Neil Henley. Jelly's lifeboat capsized immediately after launch. He scrambled onto the bottom of the overturned boat along with 4 men, but most women drowned. Jelly and 1 other man managed to climb onto a floating piece of the pilot house. The other man succumbed to exposure. Jelly was eventually rescued by a passing ship near Vancouver Island. Neil Henley, the sole surviving crew member, said that most of the lifeboats were either filled with water. He managed to launch a boat with 15 women and 6 men, but it capsized instantly. Henley swam to a piece of the deck that had 7 survivors, including the captain and first mate, but all were washed away or died from exposure. Henley was the only one found later. The coroner's inquest in Victoria revealed that the Pacific's hull was rotten and leaked badly, making it unseaworthy. It was concluded that the collision was caused by the Orpheus crossing the Pacific's bow, and the crew of the Pacific were deemed negligent and incompetent. The inquest also criticized the lack of adequate lifeboats, only 5, with a total capacity of 160 people, far too few for the 275 passengers and crew on board. Captain Sawyer faced manslaughter charges for abandoning the scene without verifying the fate of the Pacific. Though he was absent from the hearing and suffered no punishment, 2 days later he ran the Orpheus aground in Barkley Sound, Vancouver Island, and the ship was lost forever. After decades of searching, Jeff Hummel of Seattle discovered the wreckage of the SS Pacific in 2022, rumored to contain a strongbox with $79,200 in cash and an estimated $100,000 in gold, now worth around $10 million. Explorers were planning more deep dives there, but not in the case of the next wreckage, where the victims were stranded in wastewater. Number 3. SS Princess Alice. On the evening of Tuesday, September 3, 1878, the Princess Alice paddle steamer made its way up the Thames from Sheerness to London. It was a pleasant evening, and passengers relaxed as the vessel rounded Tripcock Point and entered Galleon's Reach. Ahead, they noticed a large vessel, the Bywell Castle, looming nearby. On board the Bywell Castle, pilot Christopher Dix noticed too late that the Princess Alice was steering directly towards them. He ordered the ship to stop and reverse the engines full speed, but the collision couldn't be avoided. The Bywell Castle struck the Princess Alice near her starboard paddle box. Chaos erupted on the Princess Alice as passengers scrambled towards the gangways. The Bywell Castle lowered boats, lifebuoys, and ropes to assist the survivors, but many in the water drowned. Only around 35 people were saved using the ship, and about 28 using the boats. Thomas Harrison, the Bywell Castle's master, reported that after about 10 minutes, the cries from the water had ceased, leaving only bodies and debris. The Thames water at the time was polluted with sewage from nearby Barking Reach, making it foul and smelly, as described by one survivor. Bodies were brought ashore at Beckton Gas Works, London and Erith, and some were taken to the Plumstead Workhouse Infirmary. Space also had to be found for the deceased, including the wife of the Princess Alice's manager and their 4 children. The wreck of the Princess Alice broke into 3 parts: the forepart, the afterpart, and the boilers. A diver reported that the cabins were filled with bodies, crowded around the exits, likely trying to escape. On September 7th, the forepart of the Princess Alice was beached and removed. Curiously, as this was happening, the Bywell Castle passed by on its way to the sea. The exact number of passengers and casualties isn't known, but it's estimated that around 640 people drowned, making it Britain's worst inland waterway disaster. Both an inquest and a Board of Trade inquiry found both vessels at fault. The Bywell Castle was criticised for not reacting quickly enough, while the Princess Alice was found negligent for not stopping or reversing. 5 years after the disaster in 1883, the Bywell Castle herself disappeared, just after being seen off the Portuguese coast. While the Titanic's tragic sinking in 1912 remains a well-known maritime disaster, its lesser-known sister ship met a similar fate years later during World War I. Number 2. HMHS Britannic. The Britannic, nearly identical to the Titanic, was a grand vessel measuring 882 feet in length, with a displacement of over 53,000 tons. However, lessons learned from the Titanic's demise led to several design improvements. These included a double-skinned hull near the engine rooms, watertight bulkheads raised to 40 feet above the waterline, and advanced lifeboat davits capable of launching multiple lifeboats at once. Despite these enhancements, the Britannic's journey was short-lived. On November 21, 1916, just a year after its completion, while en route to the Greek island of Lemnos, disaster struck. Sailing at high speed through the Key Channel, the ship was rocked by a powerful explosion near its bow. The source was later attributed to a German-laid mine. Water poured into 6 compartments, surpassing the ship's limit for survivability. Open portholes, left ajar for ventilation, worsened the situation, allowing water to flood upper decks. Captain Bartlett attempted to beach the ship on a nearby island to prevent sinking, but the damage was too severe. Lifeboats were prepared, but a critical misstep occurred. Several lifeboats were launched prematurely while the ship's massive propellers were still turning. 2 boats were sucked into the blades, resulting in devastating loss of life. Witnesses described the chaotic scene as survivors clung to wreckage or swam desperately away from the sinking vessel. In just 55 minutes, the Britannic succumbed to the sea. Of the 166 crew and medical personnel on board, 30 lives were lost. Remarkably, many survived the ordeal, including Violet Jessop, who had also survived the Titanic disaster. Her harrowing escape from a lifeboat destroyed by the propellers became one of the most vivid accounts of the tragedy. The Britannic's wreck now lies beneath the waters off the coast of Kea, but the remains of some of the explorers from the last wreckage in our list from 200 years ago are still to be found, and the story of survivors sounds almost like a myth. Number 1. The Essex. One of the most gruesome shipwrecks in history happened 200 years ago when the fishing vessel Pacific Dawn set sail through the quiet waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The crew's goal was clear: to catch fish prized for their meat and oil. One mid-June day, Captain Martinez decided to take a few crew members in the small fishing boat to track a large school of tuna. The rest of the crew stayed aboard the Pacific Dawn to conduct repairs. Suddenly, as they scanned the horizon, the crew spotted a massive shark swimming just beneath the surface. It was about 40 feet long, a looming predator that created an immediate sense of unease among the crew. The shark circled closer, pushing fear into the hearts of those on board. With a powerful lunge, it crashed into the Pacific Dawn, sending shockwaves through the boat and chaos among the crew. The shark struck again, tearing into the side and creating a breach that allowed water to flood in. Panicking, the crew hastily lowered the remaining fishing boat, filling it with whatever supplies they could grab: navigational tools, canned food, and water. But as the Pacific Dawn sank beneath the waves, they found themselves stranded in the vast ocean, far from any land. Captain Martinez wanted to head toward the closest islands marked on their maps, but some were hesitant, fearing the islands might be inhabited by hostile locals. Instead, they made the difficult decision to drift southward, hoping to catch the attention of a passing vessel. The days turned into weeks, their food supplies dwindling to nothing. Desperate, they turned to cannibalism, and when help finally came, only 8 of the original 21 crew members survived this harrowing ordeal at sea. And that's all